Hello students, welcome to video number 5 in the chemistry series. We're going to continue on with the biochemistry part of this chapter, now moving on to the organic compounds. First, kind of just generally talking about them and how they are made, and then looking more closely at the different carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. This particular lecture will focus on kind of the intro to organic compounds, as well as 2.8 and 2.9, which is carbohydrates and lipids. So what is an organic compound? Again, to kind of refresh your brain, an organic compound is anything that contains carbon. The two exceptions to this are carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. They are considered inorganic compounds, even though they do contain carbon. Carbon is considered an electroneutral atom, so it shares electrons. It never gains or loses them. It is always going to make covalent bonds with other elements, and typically makes 4 covalent bonds with other elements in order to fulfill the octet rule. Organic compounds are unique to living systems, so we do not find them in things that are non-living, and our 4 major classes of organic compounds, which are sometimes referred to as biomolecules, are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. We're going to do carbohydrates and lipids first. I have a separate lecture on proteins, and then a separate lecture on nucleic acids. Many of the organic compounds, many of our biomolecules are what we call polymers. These are these really large compounds that are made of these really small building blocks that have a similar structure, and we call them the monomers. So monomers come together to make polymers. Mono meaning one, poly meaning many. We make these polymers from the monomers by a reaction that we call dehydration synthesis, so the removal of water, dehydration, right? And then these polymers are broken down into monomers by a reaction that we call hydrolysis. Hydro meaning water, lysis meaning splitting, and so literally what we're talking about is water splitting. Let's look at dehydration first. Here you can see you have 2 different monomers. If we take the OH from this monomer and the H from this monomer, we can get water. If we remove that water, we now have a covalent bond formed between these 2 monomers through this oxygen atom. Hydrolysis is the exact opposite of dehydration synthesis. Rather than taking water away, we are adding water in. So here are our 2 monomers linked by a covalent bond. If we add water, that splits the polymer here back into its 2 constituent monomer parts, with the OH here and the H over here. So here's our dehydration synthesis, removing water to take 2 smaller building blocks and make a larger polymer. Here's our large polymer going through hydrolysis, adding water and splitting them into the constituent parts. An example down here, we have glucose and fructose. If we take water away, we make sucrose. By joining these 2 together, if we add water back in, it splits the sucrose molecule back into the constituent glucose and fructose. Every semester, students mix these up. What I suggest you focus on is this particular word here, hydrolysis. Literally, hydro means water and lysis means splitting. So hydrolysis is the reaction that will break the polymer into the monomer. If you could just remember that lysis is splitting, then you won't have as much of a difficulty remembering which one is which. When we take water away, we synthesize new stuff. When we add water in, we're going to break the larger stuff into the smaller stuff. Alright, let's talk about carbs first. So primarily we're talking about things like sugars and starches. All carbohydrates have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and that's pretty much it. They are the major source of fuel for our body, and they also serve as a structural molecule. Some of our other biomolecules, such as RNA, even use carbohydrates as part of their structure. We have 3 classes of carbohydrates. Monosaccharides are what we call simple sugars. It's literally 1 sugar. Disaccharides are 2 sugars, 2 monosaccharides coming together to make a disaccharide. And then polysaccharides are what we call many sugars. These are the large compounds that are composed of all of the little monosaccharide subunits. Let's look at some of those. So here you go. Here are several of the different monosaccharide carbohydrates that we find. The most important one of these, or one of the most important one of these, is glucose. It's our energy, the major source of energy for us and fuel. These 3 here, galactose, fructose, and glucose, are called hexose sugars because they contain 6 carbon atoms. Deoxyribose and ribose, which are structural components of DNA and RNA, are what we call pentose sugars because they have 5 carbon atoms. Disaccharides, 2 linked monosaccharides. So the one that you may be most familiar with, table sugar, sucrose, is a molecule of glucose linked to a molecule of fructose. We also have maltose. So when you get malted milk, for instance, it's 2 glucose molecules that have been linked. And then lactose, which is in milk, which some people are intolerant to, is galactose and glucose. The polysaccharides are these long, long chains of monosaccharides. There are several different storage forms of polysaccharides, and that's really what most of these polysaccharides are for storage of these different monosaccharide subunits, particularly glucose. For us, our storage form is glycogen. You can see it's this kind of a branched one. Let's see, I don't know if I have a, no. There's also, in terms of major polysaccharides, for us, again, it's glycogen, and so in the liver, when the liver uptakes lots of glucose, it will then take all the little glucose subunits and turn it into glycogen for storage so that we have it available later. In plants, they have not only like potatoes, starches, that's another polysaccharide, and then there's also something called cellulose, which is found in plants, which is a polysaccharide that we are unable to digest, actually. So when we say you should eat lots of fiber, that's cellulose, and we don't have the proper bacteria in our gut to digest it, and so that's why things that are high in fiber have that kind of diuretic type of effect. Let's watch a little video about monosaccharides and polysaccharides.
Polysaccharides are polymers, long chains consisting of hundreds to thousands of linked monosaccharides.
So here you go. Here's your starch molecule. This is what you find in potatoes. Here's glycogen, which is us, and cellulose down here, which is also found in plants, but we are unable to digest it. We can digest starch, but not cellulose. All right, let's talk about lipids. Lipids also contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, usually in lesser numbers than the carbohydrates, and sometimes lipids will also contain phosphate. Lipids, these are our fats. So they don't dissolve in water, right? Oil and water don't mix. Lipids are insoluble in water. And we have 4 main types of lipids. We have the triglycerides, the phospholipids, the steroids, and the eicosanoids. And we're going to talk briefly about what each of those are. So the triglycerides are what we call neutral fats. So if it's a solid, kind of at room temperature, think of like butter or lard, we tend to call it fat. Whereas if it's an if it's a liquid at room temperature, then we tend to call it an oil. But both are made up of these triglycerides. And the major function for triglycerides are kind of multifold. There's a lot of energy stored in lipids. Fats also work as insulation and a layer of protection for some of our kind of more like your kidneys, for instance, get kind of held in place and insulated and protected by a layer of fat around them. If we look at triglycerides, they get the glyceride part of their name because they have this kind of almost backbone of a molecule that we call glycerol, and then the tri because they have three little chains of what we call fatty acids. And so the glycerol and the fatty acids are kind of the building blocks for our triglycerides, or our neutral fats. So I mentioned earlier the whole solid fat versus kind of oil fat. It has to do with the saturation of the fatty acids in the triglyceride. In saturated fatty acids, like this here, stearic acid, all of the carbons are single bonded. And so because they have this kind of linear structure like this, they can stack on top of each other and solidify. So that's like butter. Conversely, oleic acid and other unsaturated fatty acids, they will have at least one double bond between two of the carbon atoms. They might have more, but they have to have at least one. And so this adds this little kind of kink into the structure of the fatty acid. And so they can't stack on top of each other anymore and pack really tightly together. And so unsaturated fatty acids are things like plant oils, olive oil, avocado oil, and so on and so forth. But that is why the animal fats, which are saturated, tend to be solid at room temperature, whereas the plant fats tend to remain oils at room temperature because of this unsaturation, because of this double bond between the carbon atoms and the little kink that it causes in the structure of the fatty acid. Phospholipids are our other type of lipid. These are incredibly, incredibly important because this is what makes up the entirety of every cell membrane in every cell in your body. You can see we still have our glycerol backbone, but now instead of 3 fatty acid chains, we have 2 fatty acid chains. And because these are phospholipids, we also have a phosphorus group here kind of attached. And so what we end up with is a hydrophobic layer that is these fatty acid chains that don't like water, that are nonpolar, and a hydrophilic or polar water-loving head due to the phosphorus-containing group. You can also see here we've got this little kink in the tail, again because of the double bond. Steroids are an important part of several different hormones in our body: testosterone, estrogen, vitamin D, and cholesterol. And in fact, cholesterol is our most important steroid in our body. You know, cholesterol kind of gets a bad rap, you know, like your cholesterol is too high. But cholesterol is actually incredibly important. For one, it is the basis for pretty much all of the steroids and the steroid hormones that are formed in our body. It's also found in our plasma membranes of our cells and helps contribute to kind of the stability of our cellular membranes. And so even though cholesterol gets a bad rap, it is actually a very necessary part of our component in our body. And you can see here, this is kind of a simplified steroid. This one I think happens to be a simplified cholesterol. And you can see it has this kind of interlocking kind of hydrocarbon ring structure. And you'll find that in all of the steroids. Eicosanoids are the last of the lipids that we'll look at, and there are a bunch of different eicosanoids. They're all derived from a particular fatty acid that we find in our cell membranes, and one of the most important ones is something that we call prostaglandins, and they play a ton of different roles throughout the body. They help in blood clotting, labor, inflammation, blood pressure, just a whole host of other roles in the body. And that is the end of carbs and lipids.